people from outside the county have never heard of and never will. I tell you all of this because the work I do takes me out at strange hours on back roads that most people in this county will not drive alone after dark. And I have been doing it long enough that the strangeness of those roads has stopped feeling strange to me a long time ago, or so I thought. Fletcher County is not a place that gives up its character easily. The mountains here are old in a way that the word old does not quite capture. You can feel it when you drive the hollows at night. That quality of the land that suggests it has been watching people move through it for longer than any of the family names on any of the mailboxes have been here. I grew up feeling that, and I never found it threatening. It was just the character of the place, the way the character of an old house is different from a new one. Something has been happening in these walls for a long time. The night this happened, I had gotten a call around 11 from a woman named Cora Stamper, whose daughter-in-law was in early labor up on a property off Defeated Creek Road, which is the road my own family grew up on, and which I have driven more times than I could put a number to. It runs up into the hills for about 7 miles, before it dead ends at a gate that belongs to a timber company that has not actively used the land in years. The Stamper place was about 4.5 miles up that road, a house I'd been to before for prenatal visits, 2 stories, aluminum siding, a propane tank by the back door. I knew exactly where I was going. It was October and the leaves were down early that year, which happens in the mountains when the summer has been dry. The road surface was decent for about the first 2 miles, and then it became what it always becomes past the second creek crossing, which is a single lane of patchy asphalt, with the center heaved up by tree roots and the shoulders dropping off in ways that will take your front tire if you drift. I was driving my work truck, a 2019 Silverado I keep equipment in the back of, and I had my headlights on high because there are deer on that road constantly. And I've learned not to trust the dark margins. I was coming up on the 3rd mile marker, which is just a post someone hammered in decades ago and painted white, when I noticed something in the road ahead of me. At first I took it for a dog. The shape was low and dark, and was moving across the road from the left shoulder toward the right, which would put it moving from the creek side toward the hillside. I tapped the brakes and slowed because deer and dogs both do unpredictable things when headlights hit them, and I did not want to be dealing with a damaged truck on top of a labor call. The thing stopped in the middle of the road. I was about 60 feet back from it at that point, and I had my high beams on, and what I was looking at did not resolve into anything I had a name for. It was low to the ground the way I initially thought, but the shape was wrong for a dog. Too long through the body, and the way the legs were positioned was wrong. Dogs have a shoulder height that is proportional to their length, in a way that reads as normal even when you cannot see them clearly. This had a body length that did not match the height of its legs. It looked compressed, like something that was meant to be taller had been pressed down. I stopped the truck completely. The thing turned its head toward my headlights. I could not make out features. What I could see was that the head was large relative to the body, disproportionately large, and it was held low, chin nearly to the road surface, while the body remained still. The posture of it was the thing that sent the first real alarm through me, because it was not the posture of an animal caught in headlights. Animals caught in headlights have a quality of freezing to them, a particular tension that you can read even from a distance. This was not frozen, this was watching. There is a difference, and I knew it the moment I saw it. I sat in the truck for what was probably 30 seconds with the engine running, and my foot on the brake and my eyes on the thing in the road. It did not move. I reached down and hit the horn once short, the way you do with deer to spook them into moving. The thing did not flinch. It turned its head slightly, tracking something I could not see to the right of my truck, and then it turned back to face me. That movement, the deliberateness of it, the quality of attention in it, was what made me reach for my phone. I was going to call someone. I do not know who. I do not know what I would have said. But reaching for the phone was the only concrete action my brain could produce in that moment. And so I reached for it, and when I looked back up at the road, the thing was gone. not in the process of leaving. Gone. The road ahead of me was empty as far as my headlights reached. I sat there for another full minute before I put the truck back in drive and continued up the road. I drove the remaining mile and a half to the stamper place at a speed that I will not specify, and I parked as close to the front door as I could get. And I did not look at the tree line when I got out of the truck. The delivery went fine. A boy, 7 pounds and change, born at 2:40 in the morning with no complications. I stayed until dawn the way I always do when the road back is one I do not want to drive in the dark, though Cora Stamper probably thought I was just being thorough. I have driven that road many times since. I have not seen it again on that road. But I want to tell you about the thing I did not include in the account I gave my husband when I came home that morning, because I told him most of it, but not all of it, and the part I left out is the part I have thought about every day since. When I stopped the truck and the thing was in the road ahead of me, in the 10 or 15 seconds before I reached for the phone, I heard something. Not from the road. From my left. From the creek side of the road, outside the truck, close enough to the driver window that the sound came through clearly despite the engine noise. It was a sound I have heard before in the course of my work. A specific sound that is biological and not easy to mistake once you have heard it in the right context. It was the sound of something breathing in the pattern of something that is working very hard to stay quiet while it breathes. Controlled, deliberate breathing from something that was next to my door. I did not look at the window. I want to be honest about that. I did not look because in that moment, my entire body understood something that my brain had not yet caught up to, which was that looking was not the right choice. I kept my eyes on the thing in the road and I reached for the phone, and the thing in the road disappeared, and the breathing outside the window stopped at the same moment. Not one and then the other, at the same moment. I have been a midwife for 19 years. I have driven those hollow roads at every hour. I have sat with women in the hardest moments of their lives and kept my head and done the work. I'm not a person who is easily rattled. What I have not been able to shake, what I'm writing down here because I need it somewhere outside my own head, is the coordination of it. The thing in the road and the breathing at the window. Two positions, one moment of stopping. Whatever was in that road and whatever was at my window were not operating independently. They were doing something together. And whatever it was they were doing, I was in the middle of it. The Stamper boy is 4 years old now. I see him occasionally when I run into Cora in town. He is healthy and loud and exactly what a 4-year-old should be. I delivered him and I will always be glad I made it up that road that night. I just cannot tell you what else made it up that road with me. I do not have that information, and I think that is probably for the best. There is one more thing I keep returning to, and I did not tell my husband this part either, because telling him the rest of it already cost me more sleep than I want to admit, and this piece sits differently from everything else. About 3 weeks after that night, I was driving the same road for a different call, different family, different part of the ridge. Daylight this time, mid-morning, the kind of clear autumn day where the light comes down through the bare trees and makes the road look almost pretty. I was passing the spot where the thing had been, the 3rd mile marker with its white post, and I noticed something on the creek bank below the road. There was a depression in the soft mud along the waterline, a long, low channel pressed into the earth, like something heavy had been lying there for a sustained period. Not a track, not a single impact, a resting impression, the kind of thing a large animal leaves when it has been bedded in one spot for hours. It was on the creek side of the road, directly below where I had been parked. The length of the depression was longer than I wanted to think about. I did not stop to measure it. I kept driving and I delivered that baby and I came home and I did not tell anyone what I saw on the bank. I am telling you now. I do not know what to do with it beyond telling it. Some information does not come with instructions. Story 2. I grew up in the kind of family where you learn to fix things yourself or they stay broken. My dad was a pipe fitter. His dad before him worked the mines. And by the time I was 12, I could rewire a circuit breaker box and replace a water pump. and I thought that made me capable of handling most things the physical world could throw at me. My name is Bertram Hollis, and I'm 38 years old, and I've lived my whole life within 20 miles of Fayetteville, West Virginia. I do residential electrical work now, mostly in the New River Gorge area, which means I spend a lot of time on back roads, going to and from properties that people have restored or are in the process of restoring. Some of these properties are deeply rural. Some of them are the kind of rural where the last person who lived there full-time did so before indoor plumbing was standard. I've worked in places where the trees around the house have grown so close and so large that the interior stays dark at noon. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I'm not someone who startles easily in the woods, and I'm not someone who has a history of seeing things that are not there. My whole working life is about finding the source of a problem and fixing it. Loose connections, faulty grounds, the thing that is wrong, and the solution to the thing that is wrong. That is how my brain works. What happened to me on the Henley property last fall does not fit that framework. I have spent months trying to make it fit, and it does not. The Henley property is about 6 miles outside of Fayetteville on a road that used to be a county road and is now privately maintained, which means it is gravel and it is rough, and in wet weather it requires a 4-wheel drive vehicle with decent clearance. The family that owns it now bought it as a vacation property and have been slowly renovating the original farmhouse, which dates to the early 1900s and needed substantial work. I was contracted to do the complete electrical overhaul. New panel, new wiring throughout the whole job. It took me 3 separate visits over 2 weeks to complete. The first 2 visits were fine. The house was uninhabited during the renovation, which is normal, and I was working alone, which is also normal for the kind of work I do. The property sat on maybe 40 acres, mostly wooded except for a cleared area around the house and a lower field that was overgrown with goldenrod and had not been mowed in years. There was a barn about 200 feet from the house that was in worse shape than the house itself. Half the roof caved in, the loft floor collapsed. I stayed out of the barn because it was structurally unsound and because the owners had not contracted me to do anything with it. The third visit was a Thursday in mid-November. The weather had been cold and wet the week prior, but that Thursday was clear and cold, a good working day. I got to the property around 8 in the morning and let myself in with the key the owners had left for me and got to work on the last of the panel connections, which were finicky because of the age of the existing wiring I was tying into. I worked through the morning and stopped around noon to eat a sandwich in my truck. The property was quiet the way rural properties are quiet when nobody's around. Wind in the treetops, a crow somewhere distant. Nothing that would make you uneasy. I went back inside after lunch and worked through the afternoon. By 3 o'clock I had the panel work done and was doing my final checks, going room to room with my tester making sure every circuit was reading correctly. The house had 2 stories and a partial basement, unfinished, concrete floor where the old furnace had been. I had been in the basement twice before on the prior visits, and it was unremarkable. Low ceiling, bare bulb lighting I had installed, exposed stone foundation walls, the usual smell of old concrete and moisture. I went into the basement for my final check around 3:30. The light was working, the 2 circuits that served the basement were reading correctly. I was about to come back up the stairs when I noticed that the far corner of the basement, the corner that was furthest from the stairs and furthest from the only bulb, was darker than it should have been, not in a way I could immediately explain. The bulb was working. The rest of the basement was normally lit, but that corner had a quality of darkness that was inconsistent with the light source and its position. A darkness that was denser than it should have been given the geometry of the room. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at that corner for a moment. I am an electrical worker. My first thought was that the bulb coverage was insufficient and I needed to add a fixture. My second thought, which arrived about 2 seconds after the first, was that the corner was not just dark. Something in the corner was creating the darkness. Something was there. I cannot tell you how I knew that. I've been asked this question by the 2 people I've told this story to, and I cannot give them a satisfying answer. I knew it the way you sometimes know something that your body understands before your conscious mind catches up. The corner was occupied. Something was in it that was absorbing the light rather than just being in shadow. It was wrong in a physical way that I do not have the technical vocabulary to describe precisely. I did not move toward the corner, and I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight and pointed it at that corner, and what I saw in the beam is the part I have the most difficulty talking about. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was almost nothing. Almost. In the flashlight beam, I could see the stone foundation wall and the concrete floor, and the beginning of what I thought for 1 second was a crack in the foundation stone, a long vertical crack at the corner seam where 2 walls met. But it was not a crack. It was too dark for a crack in stone, and the edges of it were wrong. The edges were not the rough, irregular edges of fractured stone. They were smooth and slightly curved inward. While I was looking at it, it moved. Not much, not dramatically. A slow contraction, maybe 2 inches along its vertical length, like something pulling back, like something that had been pressed against the wall, pulling itself back from the light. I went up the stairs. I did not run. I walked up those stairs at a pace that I am proud of, because every part of me wanted to run, and I did not. I went upstairs, I packed my tools, I locked the house, and I drove off that property. I finished my paperwork from home and sent it to the owners by email and invoiced them for the completed work. When they reached out about a small issue with one of the bedroom circuits a month later, I referred them to another electrician I know and told them I was booked out. I did not explain. I am not going to explain to those people what I saw in the corner of their basement because there is nothing I can say that would be useful to them, and because saying it out loud to people who do not already believe that I saw what I saw is something I have already done twice, and it costs something each time. Here's what I think about when I think about the corner in that basement. I think about the geometry of it, the way it was positioned at the very furthest point from the light source and the furthest point from the only exit. I think about the fact that it was not there on either of my first 2 visits, or if it was far enough from any light that it was functionally invisible. I think about the fact that it moved away from the flashlight rather than toward it, which suggests that the darkness was not what it was exactly, but rather what it was creating around itself, and that the light made that difficult. I think about what it was doing in the corner of an uninhabited farmhouse basement in November. Whether it had been there before the renovation began, before the owners bought the property, before the last full-time occupant of that house. Whether the renovation, the new electrical, the new lighting, the new circuits, pushing light into parts of the house that had been dark for years. Whether that changed something for it. Whether the work I did made its situation harder. I do not know the answers to any of this. I'm a residential electrician, and I do not have the training for these questions. What I have is the memory of the corner and the 2 inches of movement in the flashlight beam, and the complete certainty, the bedrock physical certainty, that I was not alone in that basement, and that whatever was there with me had been there for longer than the house had been standing and would be there long after the current owners finished their renovation and started using the place for the holiday weekends. They will not know it is there. Nobody told the previous owners. Nobody will tell these ones. That is not something I am proud of, but I also do not know what telling them would accomplish. Some things do not have a remediation. Some things are just the condition of the property, like a wet basement or a cracked sill plate, except there is no fix for it, and you cannot put it in the inspection report. What I know is that I will not go back to that house, and I sleep better having written this down than I did carrying it alone. Make of that what you will. Story 3. The summer I turned 26, I took a job that I thought was going to be the best summer of my life, and turned out to be the summer that split everything I have ever experienced into before and after. My name is Waverly Oaks, and I'm a botanical illustrator. I draw plants, technically and precisely, for scientific publications and natural history organizations, and occasionally for books. It is quiet, solitary work that I love and that I am good at. And in the summer of my 26th year, I was hired by a small nonprofit conservation organization based out of Boone, North Carolina, to spend 8 weeks in the field in the Nantahala National Forest, documenting endemic plant species in a section of backcountry that had not been formally surveyed in over 30 years. It was the kind of opportunity that does not come along often for someone doing what I do, and I took it without hesitation. I had backpacking experience. I knew how to move carefully through dense woodland terrain without disturbing vegetation, and I had worked solo in the field before. Not for 8 weeks, but I was not worried about that. I like being alone. I'm good at it. The silence of deep forest is not something I find threatening, or it was not. The assignment area was in a section of the Nantahala that sees very little recreational traffic. Not because it is inaccessible exactly, but because the terrain is difficult enough and the trail infrastructure sparse enough that most people choose easier country. To reach my primary survey area, I had to hike in 4 miles on a marked trail, and then another 1.5 miles off trail through dense rhododendron thicket that I had been warned in advance would be slow and unpleasant. It was. The first time I made that approach, it took me nearly 3 hours to cover the 1.5 miles. After a week, I had it down to about 90 minutes. After 3 weeks, I could read the terrain well enough to find the cleaner routes through the thickets and make it in under an hour. I'm telling you about the terrain because the terrain matters for what I'm about to describe. That rhododendron country is not somewhere that large things move easily. The stems grow dense and low and interlocking in ways that even a person has to force through slowly. In 5.5 weeks of moving through that terrain daily, I heard deer twice, and I heard what I'm fairly certain was a black bear once distant, crashing through growth to my east. Nothing else large. The character of that particular thicket was one of deep stillness. Things did not move through it freely. That is important. My camp was in a small clearing that my predecessor surveyor, back in the 1990s, had apparently also used, because when I cleared the site of 30 years of accumulated leaf litter, I found the remnants of a fire ring, stones placed in a circle that had not moved in decades. The clearing was about 30 feet across, ringed on 3 sides by dense rhododendron, and on the 4th by a stand of old hemlock that provided some shelter from wind. It was a good camp. Quiet, sheltered, with a small seasonal stream 20 yards from the tent that ran cold and clear. For the first 5 weeks, I slept well there and worked well there, and did not have a single night that I would describe as anything other than peaceful. The 6th week was when things changed. It started with the stream. I went to filter my morning water on a Monday, the start of my 6th week, and found the stream had dropped overnight to less than half its usual flow. This was odd because there had been rain 2 days prior, and the flow should, if anything, have been higher. I noted it in my field journal as an anomaly and thought nothing more of it. By Wednesday, the stream was reduced to a thin trickle over the stones. By Thursday, it had stopped entirely. In 5 weeks, I had come to depend on that stream completely, and its disappearance was a significant practical problem, because my next water source was back toward the main trail. I noted this carefully in my journal and planned to address my water supply situation the following morning. What I did not write in my journal that week, because I was not sure how to write it and because part of me was trying not to give it weight, was that the rhododendron thicket to the south and west of my clearing had gone silent. Not the usual silence of late summer when birdsong naturally reduces. A different silence. A directed silence. The kind that you feel rather than just hear. The silence that has an orientation to it, that seems to be coming from a particular direction rather than simply being an absence of sound. I had studied ecology enough to know what a fear response looks like in a woodland community, the way whole sections of forest go acoustically flat when a predator moves through. This was not quite that. It was localized. It was specific to the south and west of my clearing, and it had started on Tuesday, and by Thursday, it had not lifted. I told myself, it was drought stress. Reduced water will affect wildlife behavior and movement patterns in ways that can dramatically alter the acoustic character of an area. I had a rational explanation and I applied it. The thing about rational explanations is that they work very well right up until they stop working. And the moment they stop working is rarely gradual. Thursday night, I woke at some point that my watch said was 2:14 and the clearing was bright with moonlight. The kind of bright that only comes when the sky is completely clear and the moon is high and full or close to full. I lay in my sleeping bag inside the tent and I was completely alert in the way I had learned in the prior 5 weeks to be alert when something woke me, because the things that wake you in the backcountry in the middle of the night are usually worth being alert about. A falling branch, a passing animal, a change in the weather. What had woken me was not any of those things. It was a smell. I am a botanical illustrator. My sense of smell is one of my working tools. I have spent years learning to identify plants, in part by their chemistry, the specific aromatic profiles of different species, and so my sense of smell is trained and attentive in a way that most people's is not. The smell that had come into the tent was outside my experience. Not in a way that suggested something artificial or chemical. It was organic, deeply organic. But it was not any combination of forest smells that I had encountered in 5 weeks of daily work in that terrain. It was something underneath the forest, something older, something that the forest was sitting on top of. The closest thing I can compare it to is the smell of a spring seep when you first break the ground above it. That cold mineral smell of water that has been sealed underground for a long time meeting air for the first time. Except there was something else in it. Something I do not have a botanical reference for. I lay still and I breathed through my mouth to reduce my smell signature, which is something you learn to do when you are trying not to alert wildlife to your presence. And I listened. The clearing was quiet in the specific way it had been quiet all week, that directed southward silence. And then from the rhododendron to the south, I heard something that made every hair on my arm stand. Not a sound exactly, a pressure change. The rhododendron to the south of my clearing is so dense that when something of sufficient mass moves through it, there is a wave of resistance, a compression of air ahead of whatever is pushing through the growth. I have felt this before with deer and once with a bear. This was larger than either of those. The compression was sustained over a longer period, and it was moving at a pace that was slower and more deliberate than either a deer or a bear moves through that terrain. Things move quickly through dense growth when they can, because dense growth is uncomfortable. Whatever was moving through the rhododendron to the south of my camp was not moving quickly. It was taking its time. It was not finding the growth uncomfortable. It reached the edge of my clearing and stopped. I know it stopped because the pressure change stopped. The acoustic character of the clearing shifted in the way that open spaces shift acoustically when they become occupied by something that was not there before. A subtle change in the quality of the air, the way a room sounds different with someone standing in it than it sounds empty. I lay in my sleeping bag with my eyes open and my heart doing things that I was consciously trying to control because I needed to be quiet. And I stared at the tent fabric above me and thought very carefully about what my options were. I had a knife. I had a small air horn that the organization had given me for bear encounters. I had my phone, which had no signal. I had a headlamp clipped to the tent pocket above my head. What I did not have was any certainty that using any of these things was the right response to whatever had just come to the edge of my clearing. I stayed still. For 1 hour and 23 minutes, by my watch, I stayed still. The presence at the edge of the clearing did not advance. It did not make a sound that I could hear with my ears. What it did was remain. For 1 hour and 23 minutes, something stood at the southern edge of my clearing, while I lay in my tent and tried to breathe silently. And then at 3:37 in the morning, the pressure in the clearing changed again, and the acoustic quality of the space shifted back and I was alone. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I broke camp and went to the edge of the clearing on the south side and looked at the ground and the rhododendron edge. The ground at the boundary of the clearing was soft from the recent rain before the drought, and what I found there is the part I have been carrying and have not known what to do with since. There were no tracks. I was looking for tracks and there were none. What there was, along a stretch of maybe 4 feet at the place where the rhododendron met the clearing, was a series of compressions in the moss and leaf litter that were consistent with pressure from above. Not footprints, pressure marks. As if something had been standing in that spot and the weight of it had simply pressed the ground material flat and smooth beneath it. 4 or 5 of these compressions, irregularly spaced, in a rough line along the clearing edge. And in the rhododendron behind them, a channel. A wide, low channel through the stems and leaves that ran south through the thicket for as far as I could follow it before the train turned and I lost the trace. The stems on either side of the channel were bent outward, not broken. Bent as if they had been pushed aside slowly and deliberately by something moving through them that was very wide and very low to the ground. Very low to the ground. I keep coming back to this. Whatever I heard compressing the air as it moved through that thicket was tall enough and heavy enough to create the pressure change I felt in the clearing, but the channel it left through the rhododendron was pressed at a height no taller than 3 feet from the ground. Those two things are inconsistent with any animal I know of. I completed my survey from a base camp closer to the main trail for the final 2 weeks. I submitted my work to the organization and received positive feedback on the quality and completeness of my documentation. I have not gone back to that section of the Nantahala. I have not been able to make myself go back to any backcountry work alone since, which has affected my career in ways that I am still managing. The conservation organization published a portion of my illustrations in their annual report last year. I looked at them when the report came out, the careful detailed drawings of plants from that survey area, and I thought about the smell that woke me, and the pressure change in the clearing and the low channel through the rhododendron. And I thought about how the illustrations looked like the work of someone who was simply out in the forest doing their job, which is what I was, right up until the moment that I was something else, which was a person lying still in the dark, while something that did not move like anything in my experience stood at the edge of my camp and decided, for reasons I will never know, to leave. I think about the decision in that. The 1 hour and 23 minutes of standing, and then the leaving. Whatever was there had time. It had access. It knew exactly where I was, and it turned around and went back through the rhododendron the way it came, which means whatever it came for. It either found it or decided it had satisfied itself in some way I cannot understand, and then it left. I still draw plants. I draw them from specimens now, or from reference material, or from locations close to roads and other people. My work is still good, but something in the way I look at dense woodland has changed permanently. And when I'm drawing the thick leaves and twisted stems of rhododendron for a scientific publication, I sometimes think about the channel pressed through a thicket in the Nantahala, and what made it and where it went. Story 4. My name is Aldous Fitch, and I run a small furniture restoration business out of my shop in Summers County, West Virginia. I have been doing this work for 22 years, and before that I spent 6 years doing general carpentry, and before that I grew up on my grandfather's property in the hills above Hinton, where we kept cattle and a large kitchen garden, and where I learned to move through wooded terrain before I learned to drive. I say all of this because people who have grown up working land in these hills carry a particular relationship with the natural world that is different from people who encounter it recreationally. And that relationship includes an intimate familiarity with what belongs and what does not. I know what belongs in those woods. I know the sounds and the smells and the behavioral patterns of what lives there. I have been hunting these ridges since I was 9 years old, and I've harvested deer and turkey and the occasional black bear, and I have spent nights in the woods alone every season of the year since my early teens. What I saw on the Greenbrier River Trail in October of 3 years ago does not belong there. It does not belong anywhere that I have a category for. And I'm writing it down now because my wife found me sitting in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, 6 months after it happened, and she sat down across from me and told me quietly that I needed to put it somewhere outside my own head, or it was going to eat me alive. She was right. She is usually right. This is me putting it somewhere. The Greenbrier River Trail runs for about 78 miles along the old railroad grade, following the Greenbrier River through Pocahontas and Greenbrier counties. It is a rail trail, flat, well-maintained, accessible. I have hiked sections of it many times over the years, and in October of 3 years ago, I drove up to do a 3-day solo section, about 25 miles of it, starting from a trailhead near Marlinton. I had done this particular section twice before. I knew the terrain. I knew the campsite I planned to use on night 2, a flat area near the river that I had used on my previous trips and where I had always slept well. The first day and night were unremarkable. Good weather, the leaves at peak color, the river running clear and low the way it gets in dry autumn. I saw 2 other hikers heading south on the first afternoon and nobody after that. My camp on night 1 was a brief, uneventful sleep, and I was moving again by 7 the next morning. The second day started the same way, and continued that way through the morning and into the early afternoon. I was maybe 4 miles from my intended night 2 campsite when the trail passed through a section of bottomland where the river bent close to the grade and the trees on either side grew dense and low. I had walked this section before. It was maybe a quarter mile of close growth before the trail opened again. I had never found it anything but pleasant, the kind of enclosed green tunnel that rail trails in heavy woodland produce. I was about halfway through that enclosed section when I stopped walking. I did not decide to stop. My body stopped. This has happened to me once before in my life, early in a hunting trip, when a copperhead was coiled in the leaves about 18 inches from my next step, and some part of my nervous system registered it before my eyes did and stopped my forward movement before my conscious mind knew why. That is the only comparison I have for what happened on the trail that afternoon. Something in my body's threat detection system sent a signal that overrode my forward movement before I had processed anything consciously. I stood still and I looked at the trail ahead of me and the vegetation on either side, and I listened. The river was audible to my right. Wind was moving the treetops, and then I identified what had stopped me, though identifying it did not make it better. The birds had gone quiet in a radius that extended some distance ahead of me down the trail, not behind me, ahead of me. Something ahead of me on the trail had caused an acoustic gap in the bird activity, and the leading edge of that gap was close enough that my body had registered it before my ears made the distinction consciously. I had my trekking poles in hand, and I took them and I slowly and deliberately planted them in the trail, and I stood behind them and I looked down the trail ahead. There was a shape on the trail at the far end of the enclosed section, where the trees opened up again into the more open floodplain. There was something standing in the trail that was not there when I had last looked up from my footing, which had been maybe 40 seconds prior. It was standing at the boundary between the enclosed section and the open section, which put it maybe 150 feet ahead of me. It was in shadow because the tree cover above that section of trail was denser than the open floodplain ahead of it, and the contrast between the shadow of the enclosed section and the light of the open floodplain made it hard to read clearly. What I could read was the height of it. It was tall. Not tall in the way a tall person is tall. Tall in a way that extended above my frame of reference for what a standing thing should look like at that distance. I am 6 feet 1 inch, and I have a reasonably calibrated sense of scale from decades of measuring and cutting lumber. Whatever was standing at the end of that enclosed section was looking down at me from a height that I could not reconcile with any animal I had an accurate mental model of. It was not moving. I was not moving. The river was still audible. The wind was still in the treetops. The birds were still silent and everything ahead of me. I stood behind my trekking poles and looked at the shape at the end of the green tunnel, and the shape looked back at me, and for 60 or 70 seconds, neither of us did anything at all. And then it stepped backward, not turned and walked away. Stepped backward off the trail to the right, which put it moving toward the riverbank. 1 step, 2, 3, and then it was in the vegetation at the edge of the trail, And then it was in the floodplain trees along the river. And then it was not visible anymore. The birds started up again within about 30 seconds of it leaving the trail. I stood where I was for another few minutes. Then I walked forward slowly to the place where it had been standing, and I looked at the ground and I looked towards the river, and I saw nothing that clarified anything for me, except that the ground at the edge of the trail, where it had stepped off, was soft from recent rain and showed disturbance in the leaf litter consistent with something of substantial weight having stood there. I made my camp that night on the near side of that open floodplain section, facing the river, and I kept a fire going all night. I did not sleep. I lay in my bag with the fire between me and the tree line and watched the darkness between the floodplain trees and thought about the height of the shape at the end of the tunnel and the way it had stepped backward off the trail rather than turning, keeping whatever it had that served as a face oriented toward me as it retreated. The keeping eyes on thing. That is the part that I have come back to most in the 3 years since. The deliberate choice to back away while facing me rather than turning and going. A prey animal does that. Something that is tracking a threat keeps its eyes on the threat while retreating. Something that is itself a predator turns and goes because turning your back is not the same risk. The thing at the end of that green tunnel on the Greenbrier River Trail backed away from me while keeping me in whatever it used to look. I have two possible interpretations of that, and neither of them is comfortable. I finished the section the next day and drove home. My wife saw my face when I came in, and she did not ask questions that night. She waited until I was ready to talk, and when I was ready, she listened, and she did not tell me I imagined it. My wife grew up in these counties too. She had a grandmother who used to say that the Greenbrier country had things in it that predated the Greenbrier itself, and that you showed them courtesy, and they showed you the same. Her grandmother also said that the courtesy they showed looked a lot like letting you walk away, and that you should never mistake that for friendliness, because those were not the same thing. I do not know what I saw on that trail. I know that it was real and that it made a choice about me, and that the choice it made was to step back and let me pass. I am grateful for that choice. I intend to honor it by not going back. Story 5. People who meet me now in my current life, which is to say my life as a high school chemistry teacher in Watauga County, North Carolina, would probably not picture me as someone who spent 3 years in my mid-20s working seasonal trail crew jobs for the Forest Service in the Southern Appalachians. That is what I did between graduating with my undergraduate degree in environmental science and deciding I was not ready to go directly into graduate school. I needed time in the field, time away from institutions, time to think. Trail crew work gave me all of those things, and it gave me a salary modest enough to keep me honest, and a physical tiredness at the end of every day that made sleeping feel like a gift. My name is Cecilia Vaught, and I'm 41 years old, and I have been teaching high school chemistry for 11 years, and I'm good at it. I like the students, and I like the work, and I like the way chemistry makes the world legible in a particular way, how it gives you a language for what things are made of, and how they interact. I mention this because what I'm about to describe is something I have run through every analytical framework I possess in the 11 years since it happened, and I have not found the language for it. I'm still looking. The third summer I worked trail crew, I was stationed out of a district office that covered a section of the Nantahala and Pisgah National Forests in western North Carolina. There were 4 of us on the crew that summer, myself and 3 others, and our crew leader was a woman named Darby, who had been doing this work for 12 years and who I respected enormously. Darby was the kind of person who solved problems by looking at them directly and who communicated in very few words, all of them accurate. About 6 weeks into the season, we were assigned to clear and rehabilitate a section of unmaintained trail in a remote part of the district that the office had not had crew on in several years. The work involved removing blowdowns, cleaning water bars, re-establishing tread that had eroded or overgrown. Standard trail work, but in terrain that was steep enough and remote enough that we were going to be base camp camping at the trailhead and doing day trips in, rather than working out of vehicles. 4 nights, 3 full working days in the backcountry. The first 2 days were straightforward. The trail was in worse shape than the office had anticipated, which meant slower progress than planned. But the terrain was beautiful, and the work was satisfying in the way that trail work always is when you can see what you have done at the end of the day. We camped as a crew, made group meals, talked the way people who work together in remote places talk, about everything and nothing. I slept well both nights. The third working day was when things changed. We were pushing into the furthest section of the trail from our camp, the section that had seen the least maintenance and the most deterioration. The trail in this section ran along a ridge before dropping down into a hollow and crossing a small creek. And it was in the hollow section where we found the first thing that made any of us stop and pay attention. The creek crossing had a footbridge, or had once had one. What remained was the structural foundation on either bank, 2 large flat stones that had been placed as anchors, and the rotted remnants of what had been a wooden stringer across the creek. Someone had replaced the bridge at some point since its original construction. What caught my eye was not the deteriorated bridge itself, but what was on the stones of the foundation on the far bank. Arranged on the flat surface of the stone, on the far side of the creek, was a collection of small objects. Bones, specifically. Small animal bones, cleaned and dry, arranged in a rough pattern that was not random. I could see from the near bank that they had been placed deliberately, each one oriented in a specific direction, the longer ones radiating outward from a central cluster of smaller ones. Darby looked at them for a moment, and then looked at the surrounding area, and then said we would clear the blowdowns above the creek and leave the bridge foundation alone. Nobody argued with this. We worked the upper section of the hollow for the rest of the morning and came back down through the creek crossing at lunch, and the bones were still there on the far bank stone, and we did not discuss them. We were working our way back toward camp in the late afternoon when my crewmate, a guy named Theo who was doing his second season, and was usually the most relaxed and voluble person on any crew, went quiet in a way that was different from tired quiet. Theo was 23 and he talked constantly, and his going silent was the kind of thing you noticed. I noticed it, but I was focused on a section of tread I was reestablishing, and I did not ask him about it immediately. About 20 minutes later, Theo stopped walking and said he needed to tell us something. He had been walking at the back of the crew behind me and had been looking into the forest on the left side of the trail while he walked, the downslope side, which dropped away into dense rhododendron and then into the hollow we had worked in earlier. He said that for the last few minutes, he had been tracking a shape moving through the rhododendron below the trail, keeping pace with us. He said he had not said anything at first because he thought it was a deer and he was watching it to figure out the species. He said it was not a deer. He said it was moving upright through the rhododendron, not occasionally upright the way a bear moves when it stands to look over vegetation, continuously upright, walking on 2 legs, at a consistent pace that matched our walking pace on the trail above. He said it was staying in the thickest part of the rhododendron, where it was hardest to see, but that he had been getting partial views of it through gaps in the stems for the last few minutes, and that it was large, much larger than a person, and that it moved through the dense growth without the noise that any animal that size should have been making. The 4 of us stood on the trail and looked down into the rhododendron. The hollow below was still and I could not see any movement. Darby looked for a long time, and then she looked at Theo and she asked him calmly and specifically what height he estimated it at, based on where it was tracking relative to the rhododendron canopy. Theo thought about this and said the top of it had been clearing the rhododendron canopy in places, which put it at 8 or 9 feet. Darby was quiet for a moment. Then she told us to stay close together and move at a consistent pace toward camp and not to stop. We moved at a consistent pace. We did not stop. I do not know if anything moved below the trail while we walked because I did not look. I kept my eyes on Darby's back and I kept my feet moving, and I watched the back of her neck for any change in her posture that would tell me something had changed about her situation. Her posture did not change. We reached camp in about 40 minutes, and Darby started the camp stove and heated water for dinner, and did not say anything about what Theo had seen until we were all eating. Then she said that she had worked this district for 3 seasons, and that there was a section of this particular forest that the district biologist had flagged in an internal report as having anomalous large animal activity that did not correspond to any known regional species. She said she had read the report and that she had thought it was documentation of a misidentified bear or elk, the latter of which were not native to this section of North Carolina, but had occasionally been reported as strays from reintroduction programs further north. She said she was less certain now about her interpretation of that report. She said we would break camp in the morning after completing our final section of tread work, which was on the uphill side of the ridge, away from the hollow, and we would not go back into the hollow. We did not go back into the hollow. I have thought about Darby's measured response to what Theo reported many times since. The way she asked him a precise, clarifying question about height. The way she processed his answer without visible alarm and gave a clear instruction. Darby had 12 years of backcountry work experience, and she did not panic, and she did not dismiss what she heard. She asked one specific question, got her answer, and changed our plan. That is someone who had a framework for what she was hearing. Not a complete framework, but enough of one to know what the right response was. I never asked Darby directly what she thought was in the hollow. We finished the season and went our separate ways. I have thought about contacting her since and have not done it. Part of me does not want to ask the question because I'm not sure I want whatever the answer is. What I teach my students is that chemistry gives you a way to understand what things are made of. Every substance has a composition, and every composition can be known. I believe that. I have built my professional life on it. But I also know that Theo stood on a trail in the Pisgah National Forest and watched something 8 or 9 feet tall walk upright through dense rhododendron without making a sound, and that Darby heard his report and asked one careful question and changed our plans, and that somewhere in those hills, in a hollow below a deteriorated trail, there are small animal bones arranged on a flat stone in a pattern that was not random, and I do not have a composition for any of that. I have been looking for one for 11 years. I do not think I am going to find it. Story 6. And I need to start with something that will sound like I'm making excuses, and I'm not. I'm a person who does not believe in things she cannot see and touch and verify. My name is Patrice Ludlow, and I'm a licensed veterinarian in private practice in Johnson City, Tennessee, and I've been one for 14 years. Before that, I did my training at a college in Knoxville, and before that, I grew up in Carter County, which is the county directly south of Johnson City, on a property my family has owned for 3 generations. We ran cattle, and my father kept horses. And I grew up knowing what animals look like when they are healthy and what they look like when something is wrong. I say this because what I'm going to describe started with an animal, specifically with the behavior of animals. And I need you to understand that I'm not someone who anthropomorphizes livestock or who mistakes stress behavior for something more dramatic than it is. When cattle behave in a way that I cannot attribute to a known cause, that is significant data. The cattle on my parents' property behaved that way for the better part of 3 weeks in the late summer of 2 years ago, and what I found when I investigated the cause is what I am sitting down to write about. My parents still live on the Carter County property. They're in their late 70s, and my father's health has declined enough that I make the drive from Johnson City on weekends to help with the property work and check on the cattle. There are 12 head, a small herd, nothing my mother cannot manage with some help from a neighbor. But I like going out there. It is where I grew up, and the land is in my bones in a way that the city, which I also genuinely love, is not. In late August of 2 years ago, my mother called me on a Thursday evening and told me that the cattle had been acting strange for about a week and a half. Strange is not a specific term, and I asked her to be more specific. and she said they were not grazing properly and they were congregating at the gate of the far pasture rather than spreading out across it, and that the two youngest animals, a heifer and a young bull, had been showing stress behavior that she could not attribute to any obvious cause. She also mentioned, and this is the part that sent me to the property the following day rather than waiting until the weekend, that the dog would not go into the far pasture. Their dog is a 10-year-old border collie named Hester, who has worked cattle her entire life and who has never in my memory refused to enter any field on that property. I drove out Friday morning. I walked the far pasture thoroughly, looking for any obvious environmental cause, broken fencing that could admit predators, water source contamination, toxic plants that had established themselves in the pasture. I found none of these things. The pasture was in normal condition, the water trough was clean, the fencing was intact. The cattle were congregated at the near gate as my mother had described, and they were showing the specific low-grade chronic stress behavior that I associate with persistent but non-acute threat exposure. Not the acute panic of something that has just frightened them. The sustained unease of something that has been present in their environment for an extended period. Hester would come to the gate of the far pasture and no further. She sat at the gate and watched the field, and her ears were mobile, and her posture was alert in the specific way that working dogs are alert when they are tracking something they are uncertain about. I walked the perimeter of the far pasture, which backs up against a woodlot on the east and south sides. The woodlot is a mixture of second-growth hardwood and some old hemlock that has been on the property since my grandfather's time. My family does not actively use the woodlot for anything. It is just there, the way old woodlots are on old properties, a remnant of the original forest that was too steep or too rocky to clear when the pastures were established. I walked the woodlot boundary slowly. This is the part I was doing in my capacity as a veterinarian, looking for any physical evidence of what might be causing the herd's behavior. Predator sign, unfamiliar animal activity, anything that would explain what the cattle and the dog were responding to. I found tracks along the woodlot boundary that I could not identify. I need to be careful about how I describe this, because I am a veterinarian and I have a professional responsibility to be precise about what I claim to have observed. What I found was a series of impressions in the soft ground along the woodlot edge that were consistent with bipedal locomotion. The stride length was approximately 5 feet between impressions, which is a stride length that exceeds human capacity at a walking pace. The impression shape was not consistent with any regional species I could identify. It was broader at the front than at the back, which is the inverse of a human footprint, and it was deep at a pressure distribution pattern that indicated substantial weight. I photographed every impression I could find. I measured what I could measure. I found 9 distinct impressions in a line running roughly north to south along the woodlot edge. I stood in that woodlot for a while after I found and documented the last impression. The woodlot was quiet in a particular way. Not the active quiet of a place where wildlife is going about its ordinary business. The specific muffled quality of a place that has gone still around something. I have been in the presence of large predators enough times in my career, mostly in clinical settings but occasionally in the field, to know the difference between a forest that is empty and a forest that has gone quiet, because something in it is paying attention to me. The woodlot on the east side of my parents' far pasture was the second kind. I walked back to the gate and I closed it behind me, and I stood with Hester at the gate and I looked at the woodlot edge across the field, and I thought about what my professional training told me and what my professional training did not tell me. What it told me was that the impressions I had found were made by something bipedal, heavy and moving at a stride length that exceeded human capacity. What it did not tell me was what that something was. That is the gap that I've been sitting with. I called the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency the following week and described the impressions and sent the photographs. The agent I spoke with was professional and took the information seriously and told me someone would follow up. A different agent called me 3 weeks later and said they had reviewed the photographs and that the impressions were consistent with bear, which is the standard response to this type of report. and which I expected. I asked about the stride length and the pressure distribution pattern, and the agent said those were within normal variation for black bear and thanked me for my report. Black bear in my region do not have a 5-foot stride at walking pace. Black bear in my region leave impressions with a pressure distribution pattern that is wider at the heel than at the toes, because their plantar anatomy is the inverse of what I photographed. I know what black bear sign looks like. I have seen it on that property before. What I photographed along the woodlot edge was not black bear sign. The cattle settled down over the following 2 weeks. By mid-September, they were grazing normally across the full pasture, and Hester was working them the way she always had. Whatever had been present along the woodlot edge was no longer present in a way that the animals could detect. My mother said things went back to normal very suddenly over the course of about 2 days, rather than gradually, which is how it goes when a predator leaves an area. Sudden absence rather than slow fade. I've sat with the photographs for 2 years. I've shown them to one colleague whose opinion I trust and who has field experience in this region, and she looked at them for a long time without speaking. And then she asked me what I thought they were, and I told her I did not know, and she said she did not either, but that the stride length was not something she could account for with any known regional animal. We did not discuss it further. There are some things that colleagues look at together and then put aside, because neither of you has a framework for them, and pressing on them does not help. Here's what I know about large animals and behavioral ecology after 14 years of veterinary practice and a lifetime in this county. Animals respond proportionally to threat. The response I observed in that cattle herd and in Hester was not a brief, acute response to a single encounter with something that startled them. It was a sustained 3-week chronic stress response to the persistent presence of something in their environment. Sustained chronic stress response of that duration and consistency in 12 animals and 1 working dog means that what they were responding to was there every night for 3 weeks, reliably enough that the animals could not habituate to it. They stayed stressed because the cause of the stress stayed present. Whatever left those impressions along the woodlot edge was not passing through, it was staying. It was in the woodlot along the east and south boundary of my family's far pasture for approximately 3 weeks in late August and early September of 2 years ago, and then it left. I do not know where it went. I do not know why it left. I know that the cattle and the dog knew the moment it was gone, because the change in their behavior was immediate rather than gradual. And I know that in the 2 years since I have not found any similar sign on that property. I still go out there on weekends. The property looks exactly as it always has. The far pasture is ordinary and the woodlot is ordinary. And Hester works the herd the way she has always worked the herd. My father's health has stabilized somewhat, and my mother is managing well. On Sunday afternoons before I drive back to Johnson City, I sometimes walk to the gate of the far pasture and look across at the woodlot edge and think about the photographs on my phone and the 9 impressions in the soft ground and the specific muffled quality of a forest that has gone still around something. I do not go into the woodlot after dark. I never did before this, and I have even any less reason to now. But I also do not think about it with the kind of active dread that I thought I would. Mostly I think about it with the particular quality of attention that you develop when you have a piece of information that you cannot fit into your existing framework, and you have accepted that the framework may simply be incomplete. My training taught me what animals are. My training did not account for what I found along that woodlot edge. I am a scientist, and scientists are supposed to be comfortable with incomplete information. Most of the time I am. When I am standing at the gate on a Sunday afternoon in the low autumn light, looking at that tree line, I am somewhat less comfortable than usual. That seems like the appropriate response to the situation. That seems like the correct amount of discomfort. I just do not go into the woodlot after dark. That part I am very comfortable with.